Born under a cursed moon, Alara was abandoned as a child after a prophecy claimed she would either bring ruin to a kingdom or become the greatest Luna the werewolf world had ever known. Growing up as a poor servant in a village that feared and mocked her, she learned to survive with nothing but hard work and a kind heart. When famine struck the village, Alara had only one coin left to her name. On the day of the choosing market, where women could pay a coin to hire a companion or worker, she noticed a silent man standing alone with a sack covering his head. While everyone avoided him and whispered cruel rumors, something in his lonely posture stirred her heart. Ignoring the laughter of the crowd, Alara stepped forward and placed her final coin into his hand. "I choose him." The villagers mocked her for wasting her last coin on the strange, faceless man. But as the mysterious stranger lifted his eyes to meet hers, an unfamiliar spark passed between them, one powerful enough to make the air itself feel different. What Alara didn't know was that the man beneath the sack was no ordinary wanderer. Hidden from the world, he was the feared and powerful Alpha King Kale, searching for something he had almost given up on finding. And the moment her scent reached him, his wolf went completely still. Mine. But why would the Alpha King hide among beggars and strangers? What secret was Alara's forgotten prophecy hiding? And why did enemies of the crown seem suddenly interested in a poor village girl who owned nothing but a single coin? Alara was about to discover that her fate had been decided long before the day she chose the man with the sack over his head. But whether that fate would make her a queen or destroy everything she loved remained unknown. She paid one coin for the man with a sack over his head, never knowing he was the Alpha King. The coin hit the stone ground before Alara had time to think about what she was doing. The metallic sound rang out across the village square, sharp and clean, cutting right through the laughter like a blade through silk. For one whole second, everybody went quiet. The merchant stopped mid-sentence. The children stopped pointing. Even the wind seemed to hold itself still. Then the whispers started. Alara stood at the edge of the crowd with her empty coin purse in her hand and her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had come to Valeriano's harvest auction to buy thread. Crimson thread, the kind she needed to finish the bolt of cloth she had promised the miller's wife by the end of the week. That was all she had come for. One simple errand on a cold autumn morning. But then she had seen him. He was kneeling at the center of the circle they had made around him, this crowd of people who were supposed to be her neighbors, her community, her kind. A thick burlap sack covered his head completely, tied off at the neck with a rough piece of rope. His hands were bound behind his back with cord that had already worn the skin raw around his wrists. His shirt was torn at the shoulder. There was dried blood on the collar. And the people were laughing. Not nervous laughing. Not the uncomfortable kind that people do when they do not know what else to feel. They were belly laughing, pointing, tossing crusts of bread at him like he was a dog they were bored of feeding. A boy no older than 10 ran up and kicked dirt onto the man's boots. His father watched and did nothing. The merchant standing over the kneeling man, a thick, sweaty man with a gold tooth that caught the morning light, kept up a running commentary like he was selling a goat at market. "Barely worth the rope holding him," the merchant said with a wide grin. "Won't answer to his name, won't lift his head, probably can't lift much else either. Tell you what, first soul brave enough to take him off my hands gets the deal of their miserable life." More laughter. The coin hit the stone ground before Alara had time to think about what she was doing. The metallic sound rang out across the village square, sharp and clean, cutting right through the laughter like a blade through silk. For one whole second, everybody went quiet. The merchant stopped mid-sentence. The children stopped pointing. Even the wind seemed to hold itself still. Then the whispers started. Alara watched the kneeling man's back rise and fall. Slow, steady. Too steady for someone being humiliated in front of 100 people. Something about that stillness reached inside her chest and grabbed hold of something she could not name. She had not planned to walk forward. She had not planned to open her coin purse. She had certainly not planned to throw her last coin onto the ground in front of a stranger with a sack over his head. But she did all three. "I will buy him." The merchant stared at her. The crowd stared at her. Old Marin from the bread stall shook her head slowly, the way she always did when Alara did something that confirmed every low opinion the village had already formed about her. Alara felt the familiar heat climb up the back of her neck. She knew what they were all thinking. She had been hearing versions of it her whole life. There goes Alara, strange girl. Grandmother was a witch, they say, no father worth nomming, too soft for her own good, always picking up strays. The merchant recovered his grin and crouched down to pick up the coin. He turned it over once between his fingers and looked at her the way a man looks at someone making a very expensive mistake. "You sure about this?" he asked. "This one won't last the week. He's more dead than alive, and what's alive in him isn't good for much. I've got 3 strong men over there who can clear a field in a day. Why waste a coin on this?" Alara looked at the man kneeling in the dirt. She looked at the rope around his wrists. She looked at the dried blood on his collar and the way the crowd had formed a circle around him like wolves around something wounded, waiting. "I am sure," she said. She said it quietly. She always spoke quietly, but she meant every syllable. The merchant shrugged in the way men do when they have already taken your money and stopped caring about your choices. He gave the bound man one last kick to the shoulder, not hard enough to knock him over, just enough to show the crowd he was done with the whole business. "All yours," he said. "Good luck." Nobody helped her. She had not expected them to. She walked to the man and crouched down beside him. Up close he was bigger than he had looked from the edge of the crowd. His shoulders were broad, his arms thick with muscle beneath the torn shirt. His hands, bound tight behind his back, were not a laborer's hands. She noticed that immediately without quite knowing why it mattered. No calluses on the knuckles. No dirt ground permanently into the lines of his palms. These were not the hands of a man who had spent his life working fields. She pushed that thought away and focused on the rope. Her fingers were not strong, and the knot was tight and mean. It took her longer than she wanted, especially with the crowd watching and making no secret of their amusement. Someone behind her made a joke she chose not to hear. She kept her eyes on the rope, and her hands moving, and eventually the cord gave way, and the man's wrists came free. He did not rub them. He did not flex his fingers or shake out the ache the way anyone would after being bound that long. He simply moved his hands to his sides and stayed kneeling, still as a stone. "I am going to take the sack off now," Alara said, because it seemed like the right thing to do, to warn a person before you touched them, to let them know what was coming. He gave one small nod, just barely. She almost missed it. She worked the knot at the back of the sack loose and lifted it away. The face beneath was nothing like what she had expected, though she could not have told anyone exactly what she had been expecting. He was not old. He was not broken-looking, not the way the merchant had described. He was younger than she had assumed, perhaps late 20s, with a jaw like it had been cut from stone by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Dark hair, damp at the temples, a bruise forming high on his left cheekbone, a cut above his right brow that had bled and dried. And then he opened his eyes. They were gold. Not brown with gold in them, not amber, not the warm honey color that some people's eyes became in the right light. Gold. Clear and deep and unsettling, the way the sun looks when you are foolish enough to look directly at it. He looked at her, and she felt the full weight of that gaze like a hand pressed flat against her sternum. He was not afraid. That was the thing that hit her hardest. A man who had just been kneeling in the dirt with a sack over his head and a crowd laughing at him should have looked afraid or angry or broken, or at least something that matched the situation. He looked like none of those things. He looked at her with a quiet, careful attention, like he was reading something, like she was a question he was working out the answer to. "Can you stand?" she asked. "Yes," he said. His voice was low and even. No tremor in it, no roughness from distress. He stood. He was very tall. The crowd took a small, collective step back, and Alara almost smiled at that. She turned and walked, and he followed. She did not look back to check. She somehow knew he would follow. They walked out of the square together, past the bread stall and the empty thread booth and the knot of whispering women by the well, and she did not look at any of them, and he did not either. The walk to her cottage took 10 minutes on the main road, and 7 if you cut through the old orchard. She took the orchard path because she did not want to walk past any more people. The trees were mostly bare now, a few last apples rotting sweetly on the ground, the smell of them thick and overripe in the cool morning air. He walked beside her, not behind her. She noticed that too. "What is your name?" she asked, when the village sounds had faded enough behind them that the question felt possible. A pause, not long, but she caught it. "Kale," he said. She nodded. "Alara," she said. He nodded once, the same small economical movement as before, like a man who had learned to communicate the necessary thing and nothing more. Her cottage sat at the orchard's far edge, small and square and hers, with a vegetable patch along the south wall that she kept neater than the rest of her life, and a loom just visible through the front window that took up more of the main room than anything else. She pushed the door open and held it, and he had to angle his shoulders slightly to get through the frame. She set water to boil because it was the first thing her grandmother had always done for anyone who came through the door in any kind of trouble. Water first, everything else after. She found a clean cloth and a small clay pot of salve she kept on the shelf beside the loom, good for cuts and burns and the general damage that daily life left on a person. She set them on the table. She did not tell him to sit. She simply put the things there and turned to check the water, and when she turned back, he was sitting. She cleaned the cut above his brow. He did not flinch. She pressed the cloth a little harder than she needed to, testing, and he still did not flinch. He only watched her face while she worked, that gold gaze steady and unreadable and somehow, despite everything, not uncomfortable. It was the strangest thing. A man she had known for 20 minutes, sitting in her kitchen with his blood on her cloth, and the silence between them did not feel empty. It felt like something that was just getting started. "You did not have to do that," he said, while she was capping the salve. "I know," she said. "Why did you?" She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about most things, straight through without dressing it up. Because no one else was going to. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked down at his hands, spread flat on the table, and something shifted in his expression, something that moved through his eyes and was gone before she could name it. "Thank you, Alara," he said. Outside, an autumn wind pushed through the bare orchard and sent a handful of dead leaves scraping against the cottage window. Inside, the water came to a boil and Alara poured it, and the smell of it filled the small room. A plain, ordinary moment. A beginning she did not yet recognize as one. She did not notice the way his gold eyes moved, just once, to the door. Not the way a man looks at a door when he is afraid of what is on the other side. The way a man looks at a door when he is making sure he knows every way out of a room. She paid 1 coin for the man with a sack over his head, never knowing he was the Alpha King. Chapter 2. 3 days passed before Alara stopped watching him out of the corner of her eye. Not because she trusted him, exactly. More because she had run out of reasons not to. He had not taken anything. He had not raised his voice. He had not done any of the things that a stranger in a small woman's home might do if he were the kind of person worth being afraid of. What he had done was fix the hinge on her back door that had been sticking since spring. He had restacked the woodpile the way it was supposed to be stacked, tight and dry and sheltered from the west wind. He had pulled the rot from the base of her garden fence post without being asked, just noticed it was there and dealt with it, the way a person does when they have been raised to see a problem and solve it rather than wait for someone else to come along. He was useful, that was the plain truth of it, and he was quiet in a way that did not feel like hiding. It felt like patience. She still did not know what to make of him. Every morning she would come out of her small bedroom, and he would already be awake, sitting at her kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a cup of water, looking out the window at the orchard like he was reading something written in the bare branches. He slept on the floor by the hearth on a folded blanket she had offered him, and he had accepted without comment. He ate what she put in front of him without complaint and without excessive gratitude. Just a simple thank you, direct and unhurried, like a person who had learned that sincerity did not need decoration. On the 4th morning, she came in from checking the garden and found him standing at her loom. He was not touching it. He was just standing in front of it, studying the half-finished bolt of cloth she had been working on for the past 2 weeks, the deep red piece for the miller's wife. His head was slightly tilted. His arms were crossed over his chest. He looked the way a person looks when something has surprised them. "That pattern," he said, without turning around. "In the border, what do you call it?" Alara set down her basket and came to stand beside him. She looked at what he was looking at. The border pattern was something she had been weaving into her cloth since she was a girl, a repeating shape that curved and looped back on itself in a way that was not quite a flower and not quite a knot, but something between the two. Her fingers knew how to make it without her mind having to think about it. It was as natural to her as breathing. "I do not call it anything," she said. "My grandmother taught it to me. She said it was just decoration." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "How long ago did she pass?" 4 years, Alara said. "Why?" He turned from the loom and looked at her, and his gold eyes were doing that thing again. That careful, reading thing. Like there was a question sitting right behind them that he was not quite ready to ask out loud. "No reason," he said. "It is a beautiful pattern." He went back outside. She stood at the loom for a long moment after he left. Looking at the border she had woven 1,000 times without ever once wondering where it had really come from. That afternoon she caught him in the orchard, standing very still between 2 trees, his back to her, his head up. She almost called out to him and then did not, because something about the way he was standing stopped her. He was not resting. He was not looking at the sky. He was listening. His whole body had gone to that quality of stillness she had noticed on the first day, that controlled, deliberate stillness that belonged to someone who had trained themselves to be unreadable. She followed his gaze to the road, at the far edge of the orchard. 2 men on horseback were moving slowly through the village, the way people move when they want to look like they are just passing through while seeing everything there is to see. They were dressed plainly enough, but their horses were not plain horses. They were tall and well-fed and groomed with a precision that did not belong to traveling merchants or seasonal traders. She watched Cale
Why would the
watch
king
them.
hide among beggars?
His jaw tightened.
What
just
secret was
slightly,
the
just
prophecy
enough.
hiding?
She
Why
went
be
back
interested in a
inside
poor
and said
girl?
nothing. But she put the kettle on, and her hands were not entirely steady while she did it. He came in a few minutes later. She had 2 cups ready on the table. He sat down across from her and picked up his cup, and she sat down across from him and picked up hers, and they looked at each other across the small table. "Do you know those men?" she asked. He looked at his cup. "No," he said. It was the first time. She was certain he had lied to her. She decided not to say so. Not yet. She was an outcast in this village, but she was not a fool, and she had learned young that the right time to speak a truth was just as important as the truth itself. She filed the lie away carefully, the way she filed things she was not done thinking about, and she let the silence sit between them without filling it. That evening she made a simple soup with the last of her autumn vegetables and some dried herbs she kept in paper packets on the high shelf, the ones her grandmother had labeled in her small, cramped handwriting. The kitchen smelled of thyme and wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of the apples still breaking down in the orchard outside. It was the smell of every autumn she had ever known in this cottage, and she had always loved it, but tonight it sat heavier somehow, like even the familiar smell of home was aware that something had shifted. Cale was quiet through dinner, quieter than usual, which was saying something. He finished his soup and set his spoon down, and she could feel him working something out, turning something over. "Alara," he said at last. She looked up. "If something were to happen in this village," he said carefully, "something that made it unsafe here, would you leave?" She put her spoon down. "This is my home," she said. "That is not what I asked." "It is exactly what I answered," she said. She held his gaze. "I have nowhere else to go, Cale, and even if I did, I would not go. This is the only ground that has ever been mine. I will not be moved off it." Something crossed his face. She watched it go through him, not frustration, not impatience, but something heavier, something that looked almost like responsibility. "You are stubborn," he said. "I have been called worse," she said. He almost smiled. Not quite. But the corner of his mouth moved, and she caught it and stored it away with everything else she was collecting about him. All the small things that did not add up to the picture he was trying to present. all the edges that kept showing through the plain surface of the name he had given her and the story he had not. She reached across the table to collect his bowl, and her sleeve fell back from her wrist. She did not think anything of it. She never did. The mark on the inside of her wrist had been there her whole life, a small, faint shape pressed into her skin like a scar that had never quite been a scar, the same curving, looping shape that lived in the border of her cloth. Her grandmother had called it a birthmark. Alara had always assumed that was what it was. Cale went absolutely still. She looked up and found him staring at her wrist. His gold eyes had gone wide in a way she had not seen before, all that careful composure cracked clean through by something she did not understand. "What is that?" he said, and his voice was different, lower, stripped of the evenness he always kept wrapped around it. "A birthmark," she said. "I have had it since I was born." He reached across the table and took her hand, gently but without asking, which should have bothered her and somehow did not. He turned her wrist over and looked at the mark for a long moment, and she could see him breathing differently, slower and more deliberate, like a man reminding himself to stay in control of something that was threatening to get away from him. Then he released her hand and sat back and looked at the table and said nothing for a long time. "Cale," she said quietly, "who are you?" He looked at her. The gold of his eyes caught the firelight, and for one unguarded moment she saw everything he had been keeping behind them. Not deceit exactly, more like a man carrying something enormous who had been carrying it alone for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to put it down. "Someone who made a choice," he said at last. "That has consequences I did not fully consider." It was not an answer. She knew it was not an answer. But it was the most honest thing he had said to her in 4 days, and she recognized honesty when she heard it, even when it came wrapped in things unsaid. She cleared the table and washed the bowls, and he rebuilt the fire, and the evening settled around them the way evenings do, ordinary on the surface and complicated underneath. She sat at her loom for a while, her fingers moving through the familiar pattern of the border without thought, the curve and the loop and the return, the shape she had known her whole life without knowing what it meant. Behind her, Cale sat by the fire and watched the flames and said nothing, and she could feel the weight of what he was not telling her pressing against the walls of her small cottage like weather coming in. She went to bed late. She lay in the dark and listened to the orchard wind and thought about the 2 riders, thought about the way his jaw had tightened, thought about the way he had looked at her wrist like he had found something he had been searching for in a place he never thought to look. She thought about her grandmother, who had pressed that border pattern into her small hands when she was barely old enough to hold a shuttle, who had said with absolute calm, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, that Alara was made for something bigger than this village, but who had never once explained what she meant. Alara had always assumed it was the kind of gentle lie that grandmothers tell. She was no longer sure. Down the hall in the main room, the fire crackled and settled, and Cale sat in its light and stared at the door with the eyes of a man who knew exactly what was coming and was already deciding how to stand between it and the woman who had spent her last coin to give him back his hands. She paid 1 coin for the man with a sack over his head, never knowing he was the Alpha King. Chapter 3. The harvest festival came the way it always did, with lanterns and noise and the whole village pretending, for one night at least, that everything was fine. Alara had been coming to this festival her whole life. As a child, she had run between the market stalls with her grandmother's hand warm around hers, the smell of roasting grain and spiced cider thick in the evening air, the lantern light turning everything golden and soft. Even after her grandmother passed, even after she became the village outcast in full, she still came. She set up her cloth booth in the same spot every year, 3rd stall from the left along the south row, and she sold what she had made, and she kept her eyes forward, and she did not let them see that it hurt to stand among people who had decided she was less than them. Tonight she had brought her best work, the deep red bolt for the miller's wife, finished at last, and 3 others in amber and brown and a dark forest green that had taken her 2 weeks to dye evenly. She had arranged them carefully on the booth's wooden frame, and they hung in the lantern light like flags, warm and real, the only things she had ever made that the village could not take away from her. Cale stood beside her. He had offered to come, and she had not said no, which surprised her a little when she thought about it. She was not a person who accepted help easily. But something had shifted between them over the past 2 days, something quiet and unnamed that she had decided not to examine too closely for fear that examining it would change it. He stood at the edge of her booth with his arms loose at his sides, and his gold eyes moving slowly and continuously over the crowd. The tree line, the road in from the eastern pass, the gaps between the stalls, every direction in turn. She had stopped pretending she did not notice. "You have been watching the tree line for an hour," she said, without looking up from refolding the green cloth. "The light is nice in that direction," he said. "Cale." He looked at her. "Whatever is coming," she said, "I would rather know." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was going to give her another careful half-answer, another sentence that was technically true and told her nothing. Then he exhaled, slow and deliberate, and turned to face her fully. "There are men who have been looking for me," he said. "I believed I had more time before they found this place. I may have been wrong about that." "The 2 riders," she said, "3 days ago." He nodded. "Who sent them?" "A man named Lorenzo," he said. "He was someone I trusted once. He is not someone anyone should trust now." She looked at him for a moment, at the bruise that had faded to yellow on his cheekbone, at the cut above his brow, healed now to a thin pink line, at the gold eyes that were watching her with that familiar careful attention, except that tonight there was something else in them too, something that looked a great deal like apology. "How much danger are we in?" she asked. "Enough that I want you to stay close to me tonight," he said. "Whatever happens." She nodded once. She turned back to the booth. Her hands were steady, and she was proud of them for that. The festival moved around them, loud and warm and ordinary, children chasing each other between the stalls, couples sharing cups of cider, old men arguing about the harvest yield the way they did every single year. Elara sold the amber cloth to a farmer's wife who haggled cheerfully and left happy. She was midway through wrapping the forest green for a young woman she did not recognize when she felt Cale go still beside her. Not the ordinary stillness, the other kind. She finished wrapping the cloth and handed it over and took the coins and smiled at the young woman and waited until she had walked away before she looked toward the road. They came in from the eastern pass, 8 riders moving at a pace that was not fast enough to cause immediate panic, but was not the pace of people arriving for a festival. They rode through the outer edge of the lantern light, and the crowd began to part around them the way crowds do when something is wrong, but no one wants to be the first to say so. The man at the front was lean and sharp-featured, somewhere past 40, with close-cropped gray at his temples and the kind of posture that came from years of being obeyed. He rode like a man who expected the ground to accommodate him. He wore a dark coat, plain but well cut, and his eyes moved over the festival the way a man's eyes move over something he is preparing to destroy. "Lorenza." Elara knew it before Cale said a word. She knew it the way you know a storm is coming before the first cloud appears, something in the pressure of the air, something that gets into the back of your throat and tastes like rust. Lorenzo pulled his horse to a stop at the center of the square. The music from the fiddle player near the cider stall died out, one note at a time, like a candle going out. The crowd went quiet in that spreading, rippling way, silence moving outward from the riders until it covered everything. "I am looking for a man," Lorenzo said. His voice was clear and unhurried and carried easily across the square. "He came through your village several days ago, large, dark hair. He would have stood out." He paused and let his gaze move deliberately around the gathered faces. "I would like him returned to me. Anyone who assists in that will be generously compensated. Anyone who does not will find that unhelpful." Nobody moved. Then one of Lorenzo's men turned his horse toward the south row of stalls, and his eyes landed on Cale. Everything happened in the space of a breath. Lorenzo followed his man's gaze. Something moved across his face, something between satisfaction and contempt. "There," he said quietly. "There you are." Cale stepped forward out of the shadow of the booth. He stepped into the open space in front of the stalls, and he stood there in the lantern light, and he reached into the collar of his shirt and pulled out the burlap sack that Alara had kept after the auction, the one she had folded and set on the shelf above her loom without fully understanding why she could not bring herself to throw it away. He had taken it from the shelf that morning without asking. She had watched him pocket it and said nothing. Now he held it up in the lantern light for one moment, this symbol of everything Lorenzo had done to him, this piece of rough cloth that was supposed to represent defeat and degradation, and the stripping away of everything a man was. He held it up, and then he dropped it in the dirt at his feet. "No more hiding," he said. The voice that came out of him was not the voice she had heard in her kitchen. It was not the voice of Cale, the quiet laborer who fixed hinges and stacked wood and drank water at dawn while watching the orchard. It was something else entirely. It was a voice that came up from somewhere deep and fundamental, a voice with weight and command in it, a voice that expected the world to rearrange itself when it spoke. Lorenzo's horse sidestepped nervously. "You have nothing here," Lorenzo said, but the confidence in his voice had changed slightly, recalibrated, because even Lorenzo could feel what was coming off Cale now, that gravitational shift, that pressure. "No crown, no court, no guard. You are nothing in this square but a man with nowhere to go." "Then I have nothing to lose," Cale said. And he stopped being a man. Alara had no framework for what she witnessed. She had heard stories, everyone in Valeriano had heard stories, about the old bloodlines, about what lived inside the Alpha families, about what happened when that thing was pushed past the point of control. She had always filed those stories in the same place she filed her grandmother's stranger pronouncements, the category of things that were probably true in some way she did not yet understand. She understood now. It was not violent, the shift itself. That was the thing that struck her first. It was not ugly or monstrous. It was enormous. It was like watching a door open that she had not known was there. The air around Cale seemed to compress and then release, and where a man had been standing there was now something vast and golden bronze and terrifyingly beautiful. A wolf the size of something that did not belong in the ordinary world, its fur the color of hammered metal, its eyes twin points of fire in the dark. The crowd scattered. People screamed and ran, and Lorenzo's horses reared, and two of his men fell, and the square emptied like water running out of a broken vessel. Lorenzo himself held his ground, but his face had gone the color of old ash. The wolf did not go for Lorenzo. It turned. And that was when Alara understood the second thing, the thing that was worse than the first thing, because the wolf was not in control. She could see it in the way it moved, swinging its great head back and forth, the fire in its eyes too wild, too unfocused. Cale was in there somewhere, but the rage had gotten ahead of him. The rage at Lorenzo, at the threat to this village, at the threat to her, and it had pushed him past the place where intention lives and into something older and more dangerous. People were still running. Lorenzo was shouting something at his remaining men. The wolf moved toward the sound of Lorenzo's voice, and then veered, and then stopped and shook its head like something was wrong inside it that it could not fix. Alara walked forward. She did not think about it. Later, she would try to reconstruct the decision, and she would not be able to find one because it had not been a decision, not the way decisions usually are. It had been the same thing as throwing the coin, her body knowing something before her mind caught up. She walked through the cleared square to where the wolf stood, massive and trembling with the effort of containing what it was, and she raised her hand, and she pressed her palm flat against the side of its jaw. The mark on her wrist was warm. It had been warm since the moment Cale stepped forward, a heat she had attributed to nerves, to fear, to the night air, to anything but what it actually was. She felt it now for what it was. Something ancient and purposeful, something her grandmother had spent decades keeping safe without ever explaining why, pressing it into her granddaughter's skin and her granddaughter's cloth and her granddaughter's hands, and trusting that when the moment came, the girl would know what to do with it. "Cale," she said. She used his real name. She did not know how she knew it. She knew it the way she knew the border pattern, the way she knew the weight of good thread between her fingers, the way she knew the smell of her grandmother's kitchen. She simply knew. "Come back," she said. The wolf went still under her hand. The fire in its eyes flickered, steadied, focused. And then they were looking at her, not through her. Not past her, but at her, gold and clear and fully present. And she could feel the moment the man came back to himself, because the trembling stopped, and the pressure in the air changed, and the enormous head beneath her palm dropped. Just slightly, just enough. The way a person drops their head when they have been holding it up under an unbearable weight, and someone finally offers them permission to rest. She kept her hand where it was. Behind her, she heard Lorenzo say something sharp and afraid, and then she heard movement and voices she did not recognize, and it was over quickly. She learned later that two of Cale's own guard had been following at a distance the entire time, hanging back far enough to let whatever had to happen happen, and that they came forward now and took Lorenzo and his remaining men without ceremony or complication. She did not turn around for any of it. She kept her hand on Cale's jaw, and she looked into his gold eyes, and she breathed, steady and even, and she felt his breathing match hers, one breath at a time, the way you coax a frightened thing back from the edge of itself. The shift back was quieter than the shift forward. He came back to himself in the lantern light of the harvest festival, in the square of the village that had mocked him at auction and mocked her all her life, and he came back kneeling, one knee in the dirt, his head still bent, her hand still resting against the side of his face. She looked down at him for a long moment. He was not kneeling because he was weak. She understood that with absolute clarity. He was kneeling because it was the only posture that meant what he needed to say, because some things are too large for standing. He raised his eyes to hers. "Your name is not Cale," she said. "No," he said, "it is not. You are the Alpha King." "Yes." The square was not entirely empty. Some people had come back to the edges of it, standing in the outer ring of lantern light, watching. She was aware of them. She did not look at them. "Why did you not tell me?" she asked, and her voice was quiet, but it was not hurt. Exactly, it was something more complicated than hurt, something that had hurt in it and understanding in it, and a kind of grief she could not yet fully name. "Because I needed to know," he said, "if a person could see me without the crown. I have been surrounded my entire life by people who see the title first and the man somewhere behind it if they see the man at all. I needed to know if that was something that still existed, a person who could simply see me." She thought about the first morning, the water she had boiled, the salve she had pressed into his cut, the simple thank you he had given her, direct and sincere and needing nothing from her beyond her willingness to hear it. She thought about 4 days of silence that felt like conversation. She thought about his hands going still at the loom. She thought about the way he had stepped between her booth and everything coming for them tonight without a single moment of hesitation. She thought about her grandmother, who had guarded a secret for decades and pressed it into her granddaughter's hands in the form of a pattern and a mark, and a stubborn, bone-deep refusal to be moved off ground that was hers. "And," she said, "did you find it?" He looked up at her with those gold eyes, and for the first time since she had pulled the burlap sack from his head, she saw him fully, not the laborer, not the king, not the wolf, just the man who had sat across her kitchen table and meant it when he said thank you. "Yes," he said, "I did." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she took her hand from his face and held it out to him, open, the mark on her wrist visible in the lantern light, plain and warm and no longer pretending to be something ordinary. "Then get up," she said. He took her hand and he stood. The village watched. The lanterns swayed in the autumn wind. Somewhere at the far edge of the square, the fiddle player started up again, tentative at first, then steadier, one note finding the next the way things do when the worst has passed and life remembers it is supposed to continue. Elara did not think about crowns or thrones or the word that the old stories used for the woman who stood beside the Alpha King. She thought about one coin, cold in her palm on a morning that had looked like any other morning. She thought about how the smallest things you do, the ones you do not plan, the ones you do simply because no one else is going to, are sometimes the ones that change everything. She held his hand in the lantern light of the harvest festival, and the autumn wind moved through the bare orchard, and the fiddle played, and the village of Valeriano, which had never once known what it had in her, began, slowly and without entirely meaning to understand.